This seems to be a permission problem. The downstream status code we get is a 401. This means that the principal, which is my own account, as you remember, we are running locally. So this is running in the context of me, as we're using the default Azure credential approach. But my local account doesn't seem to have the necessary permissions. Let's fix that. To set these permissions, we need to open the event grid topic we want to assign permissions and roles, in fact, to. So let's go to the access control blade here. And let's add a role assignment. What I want to allow is my account to publish an event, so to send data to Event Grid. That means I need to be in the role Event Grid Data Sender. So let's select that one. And as a member, let's add myself. There I go. Let's click Select here. Let's click Next. That seems to be okay. Let's click Review and Assign. And there we go. I should have been added. So now I should be able to execute our code. Let's run this again. And let's give this a try. That seems to have worked. So far, so good. Let's switch to the portal. We should see the events coming in. So let's move to our event grid topic. All right, what we see here is that one event failed to publish. That made sense. That was the error we just had in the beginning, the fact that I got back a 401. So that makes sense. After that, we fixed our error and we see that 2 events matched and those were actually correctly delivered as well. So that should mean that this should have triggered our logic app. Let's go and have a look over there. And let's click that. And let's have a look at the runs history. And I indeed see 2 successful events here. Let's have a look. Antwerp 3 is one of the 2 I sent. And Antwerp is indeed the other one I sent. As you can see here. One of the main advantages of using something like Event Grid is its ability to improve the reliability and resilience of your system. As we all know, sometimes things fail. An endpoint may be unavailable due to an update or a bug, for example. In such a case, a message that is being sent will not be delivered and may even get lost. Especially in environments that need a high level of data consistency across the different integration components in your system, this is problematic. As an example, let's disable the logic app. There we go. And now let's send a few requests that should trigger the images being updated or created. That should do it. Now let's give it some time. All right, here's our events. And what we see here is that events were published, but that green thing here you see on the end, let's scroll down a bit here. Here on the right you can see that means that these events were eventually dropped. I sent the request for 2 images twice, so that's why you see 4 of them being dropped, because they couldn't be delivered as our logic app is not online at the moment. That means we have lost these events. But there's a few things we can do to help with this. Let's look for our subscription. And let's have a look. Let's open the additional features tab here. 2 things here can help: a retry policy and dead lettering. A retry policy is configured by default to retry for 24 hours, so 1 day, or 30 times, whichever is reached first. You get this out of the box, but you cannot configure this, save for the amount of retries. Event Grid itself decides if and when it should retry delivery, dead letter it, or drop the event altogether. If you want to know the fine print of the algorithm behind this, you can find that via the link on screen. But retrying doesn't always happen. Depending on the endpoint type and the returned error code, Event Grid may decide to not retry at all because retrying doesn't always make sense. In case of a 400 bad request or a 413 request entity is too large error, retrying doesn't make sense, as level 400 errors mean that the client made a mistake, and that cannot be helped with retrying. Anything in level 500, like an internal server error for example, is a good candidate for retrying, as the fault is at level of the recipient. In case of a webhook, a 401 unauthorized is also not retried. Now, if retrying fails, or if EventGrid decides that it shouldn't retry anymore, the events are either dropped or dead lettered. That is what we saw when we just looked at the overview. The events were dropped and thus lost. To avoid that, we can configure dead lettering. Let's enable that. We need to choose a blob storage container, so let's select one. And let's keep on using the one we've been using up until now, so the one for our travel inspiration app. Let's add a new container for it. Dead lettered events, for example. Let's click create here. Let's open it. As far as authentication goes, we know that the managed identity is the way to go, so let's select that. If I try to save now, this will fail. The reason for that is that a validation step to the webhook happens here. The webhook must be reachable at least. The problem, of course, is that our webhook is at level of the logic app, which we have disabled. So to enable saving, I am going to enable the logic app for a few seconds. Save. And then we hit the next error. It seems that the managed identity does not have permission to deliver to the dead letter endpoint. And that too makes sense, because to be able to deliver to the dead letter endpoint, the managed identity here needs to have permissions to write to the blob storage container. In other words, it needs to be in the blob data contributor role. But we have not assigned that role yet. So let me first open the identity blade at level of our EventGrid topic. That'll give us access to the ID of the system assigned managed identity. Let's copy this. And then let's go to the storage account. And here on the access control blade, let's grant access to this resource. And what we want to do is assign the storage blob data contributor role. So let's select that one to the managed identity. I didn't even need to copy the principal ID. I can just select the managed identity from here. If I'm not mistaken, this is the correct one. All right, let's click select. Let's review and assign this. All right, let's switch back to our event subscription, which we were editing. And let's try saving again. And now it worked. So I'm now going to disable the logic app again. And there we go. Back to where we need to be. Alright, now let's again send a request that will result in the images being created or updated. I'm only going to send it once this time. And now we'll have to wait a bit. It's going to take a little while for the events to get dead lettered, as the retry policy will first retry before dead lettering. So let's give it some time. Alright, we waited a bit, and we see this green graph show up here. Those are the dead lettered events. Let's have a look. And we indeed see that 2 events have been dead lettered. Those are the 2 failed events, one for each image blob. Let's inspect that from our storage account. So I'm gonna navigate to the container we created, dead lettered events. And I click through to the current date. And here we are. We see 2 pieces of JSON that are stored as dead lettered events. Let's open one. Now let's download it. And I've opened it in Visual Studio. Let me format it. And what we see here is the event that was dead lettered, including some additional information about dead lettering itself. But next to that, all the information that is needed to replay the event is here. So how do you replay this then? Well, we need to resend it to the webhook endpoint when the logic app is enabled again. So let's start by re-enabling the logic app. And now I need to send a request to the webhook endpoint. We can get the webhook endpoint from the HTTP trigger. So let me copy that, and I see that what I need to send is a POST request. As you know, there's various ways to send HTTP requests. We've been using the HTTP file in Visual Studio. I'm not going to change that now. So let's keep on doing that. Let's create a new request, a POST request to the webhook endpoint. I want to accept JSON. And I'm also going to state that the content that I'm going to set is JSON. And as content, I want to send the dead lettered event. So that's this JSON here. It is important to only select one event. So don't select the array brackets here. The webhook endpoint expects one and exactly one event and not an array of those. All right, let's send it. And we get back a 202 accepted, which means our HTTP trigger, the webhook, got executed. Now, of course, this is a little bit of manual work. In principle, you shouldn't see too many dead lettered events. Failures should remain an exception. That being said, things do go wrong. So if you have a lot of these, it may be handy to automate it via the Azure CLI, for example. Maybe with a PowerShell script that picks up dead lettered events, parses and resends them. Or you could go for a commercial solution like the one you see on screen now. But in any case, that is beyond the scope of this course. If things go wrong, you will of course also get the option to look at the logs and monitor metrics. As you'd expect, application insights, log analytics, all those things you've come to expect are supported for the Azure Event Grid as well. We've seen that a few times by now, so I'm not going to re-enable all of that. And that's it for this clip.